Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Kevin Chilton, Explorer Chair of Space Warfighting Studies at the Mitchell Institute Space Power Advantage Center of Excellence, and welcome to our Schriever Spacepower Forum series. Today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. John Plumb join us. He's the first Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. In this role, he's responsible for the overall supervision of policy for the Department of Defense for space warfighting. He's got a wide breadth of experience when it comes to integrated strategic deterrence, everything from space warfighting to missiles and cyber defense, as well as submarine operations. Prior to his current role, Dr. Plumb worked for the RAND and Aerospace corporations. He also commanded at various levels during a naval career that extended over 2 decades. Thanks again for taking time out of your busy schedule, which I can only imagine how busy it is these days, to join us here at Mitchell. And to kick things off, I thought I'd give you a little time to introduce yourself and what's happening in the space policy arena in DoD.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and thanks to the Mitchell Institute for setting this up. And I'll just say Happy Valentine's Day to you and all our viewers. I know we all love space, so I think maybe that's why we set it up today.
There you go.
And also coffee, so hang on one second. All right, so I thought I'd just keep these a little bit brief
Sure.
so we can get to the Q&A, which I know is what's keen for most folks. But let me just kind of give you a overview of what I've been doing for the last year and where I think we're headed. So I walked in March of 22, right? Kind of at the tail end of a massive restructuring of the department by the Congress, but in recognition of this growing value and need for space. And it's really neat, right? So we've got a Space Command now, we've got a Space Force now, we've got a Space Acquisition Executive now, and we've got an ASD for Space Policy now. And so all these parts fell into place, and now it's up to us to try to figure out, well, how do we make all of this work and make sure we're all pushing in the same direction? On top of that layer, of course, Secretary Austin, his first day in, said China's a pacing threat, focus on China. And so those two things together have really, really driven the department in a way that I find is really, what's the right word? It's encouraging to see us all pushing in the same direction. And a really important time too, because China clearly are pacing threat, and we really need to be focused on that. And I think in space, it's a perfect example of where that is true. So in the Obama administration, I worked in space policy for a bit, and to be totally honest, it was really still a hobby shop. I think there were a lot of little stovepipes, and what I would say is where we are now is kind of the entire government understands the value of space. And the department and the IC really focused together on the threat, which kind of pulls people along. So the National Defense Strategy has 4 priorities. Just deter strategic attack, deter aggression with a focus on China, defend the homeland, and build a resilient joint force. All 4 of those absolutely rely on space, in and through. You cannot be resilient without space. You cannot deter strategic attack without space. It's remarkable. And I think this growing understanding is really important. So once I kind of got situated, I've laid out kind of my 3 priorities for space and for space policy, which I call the 3 C's, which is down from 5 C's of yore. But it's space control, space cooperation, and space classification, although really what I say is space overclassification. And so those are all linked. Space control, making sure we have the ability to operate in space. I mean, space is in the U.S. DNA for the way we fight, really just for the way we execute missions in competition or in crisis or in conflict. So we have to have access to space. Space cooperation, how do we really work with our allies? All right, we're not the only game in town anymore. We have more and more allies with more and more capabilities. And so how do we coordinate with them to make sure that we're maximizing our deterrence and maximizing our ability to win in a conflict? But that is completely tied up with the classification problem. So the overclassification problem we hear about inside the Beltway is often the one about industry partners, which is also a huge problem. Like the stuff that's more classified makes it harder for industry folks to work on things, including kind of a apocryphal story of the RF engineer who's working on a super classified program, and then his company has another super classified program, and they need exactly the same skill set, but man, he can't get over there yet because he doesn't have the right tickets yet. That's silly. But from an allied standpoint, we have kind of this rampant use of no foreign as a classification designation. that really needs to get under control. How can we figure out how to share information at operationally relevant speed, not the way our information sharing was originally designed? And so pushing on that will help us unlock the other two. So that's kind of where we are and what we're working on. As I look forward, I think really key for us to really start to normalize space as an operational domain, and that's not just for the those individuals that have been doing this the whole career, not unlike yourself, but for whole of government understanding and approach, so that as we talk about space and look to push on different envelopes or develop capabilities, that it is not always having to go back to the drawing board to re-explain. I think we're making great progress there, but that takes everybody pushing on it. And I know, I talked with General Saltzman, General Dickinson, Secretary General, all of us together, understanding we have to kind of keep working on this to the benefit of the country.
Terrific. Thanks. That's a great overview. You're no stranger to policy. You've been doing
No,
this
sir.
for quite a while at the Senate, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense before. So you got to feel pretty comfortable jumping into policy. But I'm struck by the fact that even in your job title, I think the words warfighting domain are used, policy for warfighting domain. It wasn't long ago, those words were not allowed to be spoken by former commanders of Air Force Space Command. So there really has been a change, a recognition of the threat. It's fertile ground for new policies, that's for sure. You've talked about several already, but have you kind of set up a priority of, we got to do this first, do this second, this third, or is it, I mean, you're just attacking on all fronts at this point?
So when I walked into the job, the first big priority was very clear. We had just been tasked just before I got there with conducting a space strategic review by the National Security Advisor, and I think our approach has really been I'll just say a winning one, because as opposed to conducting an analysis in those stovepipes I referenced, which would have been the traditional way to do this. All credit to my team and to several members of the IC just across the interagency. We brought all our stakeholders together and had them all be contributing partners as we try to set the security environment, set the understanding. What is China doing? What is Russia doing? What do we need to be doing? And that, I think, has had a massive, helpful, I'll say payoff. It's not the right word, but because we socialized everyone and brought people together, we now kind of have this common baseline understanding of the security environment that I do not believe has existed previously. So that was the priority, and I think capitalizing on that as we go forward is kind of the meat of it. I think that answers your question. If there's more you'd like to ask.
Well, that's as a first priority. I think that makes sense. Bring everybody together, because I think past experience would indicate there have been stovepipes in these areas.
So I talked about space over classification. A lot of folks think with classification, we're going to declassify things so they'd be unclassified. I'm almost never talking about that. But bringing folks from across into, getting them right into compartments if they need to be right into compartments, or figuring out how to talk about these things across, that is new. But so everyone together with the same shared set of information is a very different situation too than individuals with different ownership of different classified pieces.
Great. If I could shift a little bit to focus a little on the threat environment.
Sure.
And General Saltzman, the new Chief of Space Operations, has said space is critical and adversaries are going to attack space. And there's no doubt that China continues to be aggressive in acquiring, demonstrating and deploying counter space capabilities. Right. The Russians have done the same, and I expect other adversaries are considering it. With that as a backdrop, could you walk us through how you see the threat environment evolving in space and what implications that has on policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, absolutely no question that China and Russia have looked at the way the United States fights, realized that we rely on space as a lever arm, and then look to exploit that as a potential weakness if they can find a way to. So that's not new or interesting on some level. That's what any worthy adversary will do, right? But they've been working hard on it, right? We know they both have direct-to-send ASATs, including kind of their irresponsible use of them in testing, where they've created a long-life debris, continue to find different ways to try to come after our systems, and so we have to be ready to defend against that. And I think we're making some good strides there. I think this growing awareness of these threats is also helping us. And so in some ways, the Russian use of that Noodle test in, I think it was late November, December 21, once again, they've overplayed their hand, kind of the standard Russian problem in some ways. But that really helped drive the focus home, helped, frankly, get the international community up on the awareness of this kind of problem and bad behaviors in space. So we've had tremendous success in the United States with kind of promoting this norm that the Vice President announced about not conducting destructive tests of direct-sent ASAT missiles. If you want to have a direct-sent ASAT missile, okay, no one's going to be able to stop that. But the fact is, you don't need to test it and create long-lived debris. But that has helped raise the overall awareness in the public, right, of these threats to space. And so for us, we need to be able to be prepared to defend against those. So one of the things we're really working on is mission assurance. And by that, I don't mean kind of launch mission assurance. I mean mission assurance of our space systems. Warfighter absolutely needs our space systems to be able to fight. Frankly, we need it to be able to deter conflict in the first place, which is the goal, right? And so how do we assure those systems? We have two main lines of effort there. One is resilience, 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 resilience. How do we get more resilient so we can absorb an attack by China or Russia on some portion of our system to minimal degradation so we can keep fighting through? Should reduce the value of attacking the system in the first place, but also make sure we can keep having access to it. And then the second part is we have to be able to defend our systems against these counter space threats.
So a more resilient architecture and then the ability to defend that architecture.
Yeah.
Very good. But let me drift into the offensive side here. And when I think about my background in the air domain, we seek to gain air superiority over the adversary's battle space as well as over our own for two purposes. One, so that we can defend our own people. So nobody strafed a soldier since the Korean War because we've been able to gain superiority in that regard. And then also we want to gain superiority over the adversary's battle space so that we can attack them in that battle space. So it would seem today that there's a responsibility, as you've described, not only to defend and protect our capabilities, but if at the same time we allow China or Russia to continue to observe our naval assets movement in the Pacific, for example, that puts our sailors in harm's way. So the logic to me would say you have to think about how you deny them access to their space capabilities and how they might use them to attack our forces as we transit the Pacific, for example, or in Western Europe. So your thoughts on that side of the equation?
Yeah, sure, thanks. And obviously I need to measure my words here, but here's what I'll say. One, China is developing a wartime architecture, you're absolutely right. And they're doing it in a much different way, right? We started building our space architecture decades ago when it was relatively a sanctuary. It was really just two governments, the United States and Russia. And that's a very different scenario than we see now. Obviously, massive growth of commercial space as well, but China has really accelerated their space systems, massive number of satellites going up every year, and it's a wartime architecture, and it's got their focus is us. So when we talk about how we're going to defend U.S. national security interests against both space and counter space threats, I've talked about assurance. There's another line of effort there, which is attribution. So we have to be able to detect and attribute hostile acts in space. That's the space domain awareness argument. You have to know what's happening in your domain, and you have to know who's doing it to you.
Certainly essential for deterrence, right?
That's right, absolutely. Yeah. And then the third piece, though, is we have to be able to protect the joint force. That's our service members in harm's way on the ground or at sea from adversary hostile uses of space as well. So how are we going to do that? This is where integrated deterrence becomes kind of more than a bumper sticker. But both to deter and to fight and win if deterrence fails, we need to leverage options across all operational domains. And so that is what we are all working really hard on.
Okay. So there is a focus then, and it almost sounds like a bit of a policy change as well from the past, where we didn't even consider countering adversary space capabilities because we couldn't talk about space as a warfighting domain, to a realization that if left unimpeded, their space capabilities could have a real impact on the outcome of a fight.
I guess I would say maybe less of a policy change and more of a security environment change.
Certainly driven by
yeah,
it, by the
absolutely.
change in the environment.
Absolutely.
I don't
Yeah.
think we started this fight. To be sure, I think we're reacting to a hostile environment.
And you can see that's how, kind of the brilliance of the secretary pivoting the building towards China has really allowed us to focus on these high-end problems.
Great. In the recent NDAA, it directs the U.S. Space Force to publish an unclassified report on how it will protect and defend current capabilities.
Right.
How will your office be involved in that?
We'll be writing that. So that's how we'll be involved in that, and I, in ongoing conversations with congressional staff and members on this type of thing. And I think, to the credit of the members who are driving this, really what folks are asking for is some ability to talk at unclassified levels to their constituents and to their colleagues about the need to invest in space and the issues with the threat. So we are working on, I don't think there's anything groundbreaking, but actually trying to accumulate, listen, here's the threat. China's, Russia, both. I've almost laid out the whole argument here, Kevin. But both China and Russia see the U.S. reliance on space, and we know we rely on space. It's in our DNA. It's how we fight. It's how we fight and win. Of course, space is more than just warfighter essential. It's actually national economy essential.
Absolutely.
Massive economic driver. The U.S. is the leader here, and we're just really at the beginning of what I think is going to be massive continued growth as long as we can preserve this secure, stable environment. So that's part one. Right, this secure, stable environment gets into this need for norms and responsible behavior, and the U.S. continuing its reputation as the world leader in responsible behavior in space, and then the ability to defend our systems and be able to fight and prevail if deterrence fails. The goal is for deterrence to hold, right? So how do we prepare for that? And so those three lines I said there, how do we assure our missions, both resilience and defense, right? How do we attribute hostile acts? Got to invest in that space domain awareness. And then how do we make sure we can protect and defend the joint force? And that's the joint force, that's actual human beings on the ground. And that space-enabled threat is a problem.
A lot of what you said sounds like the maritime domain and the kinds of international norms that have been developed over the years, the importance of the maritime domain to commerce, the importance of being able to operate freely there.
Exactly.
And the importance to be able to defend it and prevent people from attacking it.
Yeah, I think obviously I was a Navy guy, so that's kind of where my, that's where I grew up.
We
so
forgive
that's how I
you here
think
at
about
Mitchell
it.
Institute.
That's all right.
That's all right.
That's all right. You can see the sky from a periscope. But that's just one version of the domain. It just has the advantage of also having kind of that international space where rules of the road are the things that apply, right? And so, air, same issue,
Yes.
right? And so, space isn't that different. You got military craft, you've got civilian craft. We now have manned, we have manned craft and not just the space station anymore, right? There will be more countries, commercial investors trying to get people, space tourism to low Earth orbit. All of these pieces really are going to demand better cooperation, understanding, maneuver room. And of course, the flip side is you don't get to really refuel your satellites. I know folks are working on it. But maneuver has some regrets. And so how do you build these rules to avoid collisions, which are detrimental to entire orbits? Really essential.
That's great. Now, let's shift back to cooperation.
Sure.
And talk about cooperations between the intelligence community and the Department of Defense and any
good.
policy issues that might exist there. We had the advantage of having Director Chris Scalise from the NRO on one of our forums last year. And he said, to paraphrase him, Russia and China want to take away our advantage in space. And that's what we're talking about here today. And subsequently, Secretary Kendall affirmed last year that an informal agreement between the NRO and the Space Force had been achieved. I don't know if it was a signed document or just a handshake. But can you talk about how the IC and the DoD, in your view, can better integrate space-based intelligence gathering from space, collection, and sharing?
So on the specifics of your question, I probably don't have enough in the weeds on that, but here's what I can say. I think that the cooperation between the Department of Defense and the IC on space-related issues right now is as strong as it has ever been in our history. it is remarkable. It's a remarkable change even from a few years ago. I personally do believe that a large piece of that is because of the focus on China and the need to cooperate to kind of maximize our ability. But I also think part of that is that some of us who have kind of grown up in and around this, getting towards these leadership positions and understanding all the fights that have been in the past, like this have not been to anyone's advantage. And I think that's also a really great place. So we've got, I can pick up the phone and call Chris anytime. I talk to him constantly. His team is really, really leaning in on this cooperation piece, not just DoD IC, but also the allied piece as well. Routine conversations with the IC, various forums, stakeholder meetings, pull-asides. It's really rewarding. And I am conscious every single minute that I don't know if this is fleeting or if this is the way of the future. I hope it's the way of the future because everyone gets a lot more done this way. But right now, at this time, at this place, this is a very good time to be working on these issues.
And we had Secretary Trevelyan here.
Frank's great, yeah.
Yeah, and he mentioned that he wanted to leverage the expertise in the NRO for developing reconnaissance satellites. I mean, they've been doing that forever. But in the past, if you use the word reconnaissance and space in the same sentence, the NRO stood up and said, that's what we do, nobody else can do it. But there seems to be a clear need today for satellite and intelligence collection for the warfighter, dedicated to the warfighter, developed by the Department of Defense. Are there any policy issues that would prohibit that from happening?
I am not aware of them, but that does not mean I am 100% correct. I will say this particular issue hasn't come up. On some level, you're hearkening back to the old operational response to space days. We're way past that, and I think one of the reasons we're past that is the commercial availability of imagery. Yeah. Even synthetic aperture radars now commercially available. This kind of thing is changing this whole dynamic, and I think that is part of this as well. There's not just one individual somewhere in an office that controls access to this information anymore.
I couldn't agree more. I think the commercial aspects of this, whether it's infrared, optical, SAR, and even electronic now is out there. So the exclusivity is kind of OBE.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Maybe not for missile warning, missile track, but for many things it is, right?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I don't think there's much of a,
it's mission dependent, right?
There's not much of a commercial market for that.
Right, thank God, yes, okay.
So, well, good. I'm glad to hear there's no policy issues there because it's always been a point of tension. I mean, national reconnaissance means the number one priority is national intelligence collection. In a warfight, the combatant commander needs to have intelligence collection that's dedicated to he or she as well.
Right.
And so I think that opens up a lot of opportunities for.
Right. There's always this historical tension, but with the availability of more and more resources, some, but not all of that tension, I think, tends to at least recede, if not fade to zero. Nothing fades to zero, as you know. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Hey, let's switch back to resilience, if we could, for a minute, because you've talked about that extensively here.
Yeah.
And what approaches are DoD pursuing to make space infrastructure more resilient and survivable? Beyond, I mean, we're putting more satellites up. That's the plan.
No,
it goes beyond that, I think.
It's a great point, and I will just say I think it is recognized now throughout the department that resilience isn't just proliferated orbits. That may be part of it, but if your ground segment is one station, that's not resilient at all. Yeah. Right? That's not resilient against adversaries. It's not even resilient against a power failure, perhaps. And so how do you build resilience out in the ground segment? That's really important. Perhaps in the user segment as well. There's a lot of pieces to it. It is one of these things that if you start to pull the thread, you can go farther and farther, upstream on any particular piece, and you're like, wow, this isn't resilient. So there's a lot to be done, but you can't do everything. But it's weirdly baked into all the conversations. The kind of joke I like to tell is that in the Obama administration, Vice President Biden was briefed by the Department of Defense that we'll be resilient in 10 years. And then in the Biden administration, the department said, we're working on it. He said, hey, 10 years ago, you told me you'd be resilient, so let's get going. But it is in every conversation. How is this more resilient? What do you need for resilience? I remember routinely talking to Chris Scalise about these types of issues. It just comes up, not for the reason of the phone call, but it's just built into our conversations in a way that is both refreshing but really helpful. People understand we have this issue, and the adversary understands this is an issue. So how do we get around that?
Yeah, very good. I imagine cyber is a big part of that resilience issue
Cyber
as well.
is a big issue there too. That is under my purview at the moment as well. So kind of these different strategic capabilities. And look, cyber has a huge attack surface for satellites. And how do we harden our satellites against that? And of course, stuff that got launched 20 or 30 years ago, not at the same cyber standards as things you might be launching now. So one, how do you backwards help this? But then second, as you go forward, how do you build something that can be dynamically improved, right? We have to get past the idea of just a fence or a shell. We have to do defense in depth. The Solarium Commission would say that's not just for satellites, it's for all infrastructure. How do you do defense in depth of your satellite systems, both on ground and in space, so that even if an adversary has some access, the ability to do damage is minimized?
Yeah. One part of the resilience equation we haven't talked about yet is launch. You need to be able to access the domain. So getting satellites into orbit and assuming some are lost in a conflict, resupplying those, you've already talked about that a little bit, requires launch infrastructure. And to your point earlier about if you only have one ground station, that's a vulnerability. Well, we have Vandenberg and we have Cape Canaveral. We have Wallops Island now, but our launch infrastructures are on the coast and they're fixed. And so a little vulnerable to attack more than, say, a mobile launch capability or an airborne launch capability. Do you see policy having a role in that, particularly if one were to imagine some of these smaller rockets maybe being able to launch from inland locations, the deserts of Nevada, Mojave, California, places like that where we traditionally have avoided doing that, but the Chinese and Russians certainly do that. They launch from deep within their borders.
Right. So I think a little bit two separate issues there. One issue is this idea of just launch infrastructure. Does it meet our needs? Kind of at saturated launch capacity for national security space launches at this point. So I think if we had additional launch capacity, I think it might fill up pretty quick, frankly.
Right.
And I fully agree there's a fundamental difference between large heavies to GEO and what some of these smaller commercial providers look like they might be able to provide, especially to LEO, right? With a smaller rocket, smaller footprint. I know Rocket Lab launched out of Wallops recently, and that's interesting and new, right? And so how can we kind of use that diversification for resilience, not only of our infrastructure, but potentially in some future situation where you're actually trying to launch on response?
Right. And you mentioned that, a launch under attack kind of thing. We started
let's not say that.
No, not under attack.
Yeah, okay.
I meant we started losing satellites that become attrited and you want to resupply in conflict.
Yeah, that's a little bit out there, I think, this kind of reconstitution. I mean, it is a thing that in concept, but it is it's hard, right? Because the timeline,
there's implications for funding and how you posture for it, right?
Not only that, there's implications like you launch a satellite, at least at the moment, someone may have a different answer, but the satellite doesn't work 30 seconds after you launch it. And also, if there's just a lot of logistical pieces to it. I'm not saying it's not possible, but we're not going to turn a switch and that's not going to be a thing tomorrow. Right. There are some other things you might think about wanting to rapidly respond to that are a little bit less than a reconstitution problem. So I do like this idea of some type of tactically responsive launch, and I think you're going to see us trying to dig into that.
Okay, great. More on the resilience side, you commented, we talked a little earlier about, there are not many gas stations in space, but
not yet.
But there are some.
GEO is a little bit easier. Yeah.
Yes, but maneuvering satellites proliferation is one way to have resilience.
Yeah, good.
What about the ability to maneuver? You're under attack. If a maneuvering satellite's much harder to hit than a stationary one, and or even rendezvous on.
Right.
So thoughts on that?
So, right. I mean, the fuel is finite. So you have a finite amount of fuel. So every time you maneuver, you have less future maneuver space. That's well understood by all of our engineers, obviously. And I think having some excess there for that type of scenario is certainly worth considering. It's extra mass, but for survivability, that may be really useful. I do think, just on the cusp, but obviously some of the contractors are looking at ways to refuel in space or replace certain components. So that may have some play, but you have to design your systems for that. So we're at the front end of that movie.
Right. Or maybe some technologies that allow you to not rely on the conventional propellants that we use
Fair.
use up.
That's fair. And there's a flip side of this too, of course, which is so some of the proliferated constellations have very, very, very low thrust, like these Hall thrusters, and they're almost constantly maneuvering, which not quite the same type of maneuver you're speaking about. But that does change your ability to do space domain awareness if your legacy system is based on, well, there it is, so now I know where it's going to be next week. Well, not if it keeps doing this, right? So you have to have that awareness piece built in with constant revisit for these objects to see where they are, where they're headed. It's just a different problem set than it used to be.
Yeah, I'd agree. Can we switch to Ukraine and maybe some lessons,
Sure.
lessons learned there?
Sure.
There's been reports that the Russians have attempted to interrupt SATCOM capability or communications for the Ukrainian forces, and GPS jamming has been reported in that theater as well. Can you talk about lessons learned that we're accumulating as we observe how the Russians are operating in the Ukraine related to the space domain?
Sure. I say a couple things. One, this whole war is just completely unjustifiable, and I squarely put the blame on Putin for this. It's illegal, unjustifiable, and it's causing massive misery, and it's just a terrible thing. As far as some lessons learned, let me just put on my overall ASD hat here, and I'll say a couple things. One lesson, not one you asked, but the tendency of Russia to use missiles kind of exceeds anything I think I probably would have considered. It is not being used for military effects, right? They're going after civilian infrastructure, and it kind of feels like the Blitz of London World War II. I mean, it is just a tremendous, tremendous number of missiles targeting civilian populations. So one lesson learned, frankly, is that is a thing folks need to be ready for. Missile defenses are going to be important. Being able to get after these launchers and get after that infrastructure to try to missile defeat enterprise is a thing we worked on in our missile defense review, which has some space applications, obviously, because we use space to tell us things are coming. But that is a very big lesson learned, which is this is part of the future conflict, full stop. Second part, I'd say, the Russians are very keen on electronic warfare, integrated maneuver units. They have, I don't think any surprise they're trying to jam GPS or jam SATCOM. Those are things we should expect. I would say what's interesting about Starlink is the proliferated LEO SATCOM available right now. Really became available in the same time frame.
Right.
Obviously, other companies coming, but that is a really, really powerful thing because you've got your comms. You've taken them out of geo, where there's just a fixed point really to put energy on. And you've changed the equation significantly, and that makes it much harder. So it's very interesting.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you, again, a policy question here. So the Ukrainians are using Starlink. Russia recently stated that it considered Starlink satellites legitimate military targets since it is providing communication services to the Ukrainian military. What's our policy with regard to defending Starlink satellites? And do you see that evolving, or is it kind of traditional policy that would say, hey, we defend our CRAF aircraft when they're supporting military operations, we defend our commercial vessels when they're supporting U.S. naval operations, so that it would be logical that we would defend commercial assets in space?
So I'm going to answer that in two parts. The first part is this: the Russians saying a thing, and the Russians are attacking civilian infrastructure. So what they consider a legitimate target is not necessarily a legitimate target.
Violation of the law of
certainly
conflict.
Appears to be to me. I'm not a lawyer, but certainly appears to be to me. But again, I'm not a lawyer. We leave that for the lawyers of the White House to decide. On the piece of this issue about defending, so the Department of Defense will defend, commercial satellites if ordered to do so. That is a very narrow window, and I really can't say more about it. But so I don't know how different that is. but it is there as a thing that we could be ordered to do, and so we have to be able to take action to do that.
Great.
I mean, part of, I think, what you're seeing, though, this is me channeling the Russian, is Starlink's obviously driving a little bit crazy, right? Because it's new and it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so, these statements, I think, kind of reflect that.
Good. But there's no I guess to read back to you, no decisions taken, but there's no policy to inhibit it. In fact, I would suggest, going back to right after the Vietnam War, the Mayaguez was a commercial ship that the U.S. went to protect and defend and rescue the crew from. So it's not without precedent for us to use military forces to protect U.S. flagged ships, for example.
If ordered.
If ordered.
Right.
If ordered, yeah. It's not necessarily a standing order in that regard.
Love my pay grade. That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
but
Right.
so you don't see any policy issues here at this point.
Again, new terrain,
Yeah.
kind of a new frontier. Basic line is, if ordered, that's a thing we will work to do.
Okay, thanks. Integrating commercial capabilities into Department of Defense operations. So SpaceX and Rocket Lab recently announced the creation of defense-focused subsidiaries. What is the department doing to allow for greater commercial integration, a la Starlink, into Ukrainian operations?
Right.
This would be Starlink into U.S. operations or any of these other assets that are being put on orbit that look like they have potential to increase resilience.
Yeah, so first of all, the explosion of commercial available services from space clearly increases resilience for some mission sets, right? SATCOM, perfect example, right? There's tremendous amount of SATCOM bandwidth available. We can buy SATCOM bandwidth, and so you can think of kind of our resilience plan should include the ability to access different commercially available pieces when needed. And so that's a commercially available mission set, and we should be able to do that. And so I will say overall, commercial integration, absolutely key. I'm not the acquisition guy, right? Frank Calvelli is the acquisition expert, but we have had these conversations, and he's out in the front leading on this. But he's even made these statements like we should buy what we can and build what we must. So, and I think that's how we kind of help unlock this. There's obviously still a lot of barriers for small companies to get inside departmental contracts to be able to fund themselves, but I think folks are really working on it in a lot of ways. I'm not saying it's solved, but the growing understanding of the need to do this so we can move faster is moving faster is kind of at the key here. And let's be honest, left to its own devices, we can't move that fast as a department. I mean, the budget cycle, right now, we're waiting for the 24 budget to drop. We're starting to build our 25 budget, and it's February 23. I mean, that's crazy. You could never survive at the small business scale if you're working on a thing now for a 2-year later investment. And so how do we speed that up and be able to buy these, I think is really important, but I don't want to pretend like it's solved.
Right. On the flip side, what do these guys need to do to these new entities to make themselves credible and secure partners? Because you certainly need them to be not only be able to deliver what they promise, but also if we're going to rely on them, that they're going to be able to continue in time of conflict.
Right. So now you're talking kind of a commercial space operator, which is different than a piece of hardware, a piece of software that I might incorporate or might buy.
I'm talking about an operator.
Right. So the operator thing is a much bigger thing. How do you have access to that and ensure you have access to that? And I think folks are working on it. There's growing awareness of what can be done here. Obviously, industry partners have to come along. You force them to do things. That would be crazy. But I think we have a craft-like agreement with aviation, civil aviation, and while it wouldn't necessarily be quite the same, there may be ways to have some type of access in times of need the department could have agreements on. Luckily, I'm also not the contracts guy, so I can just kind of talk about it without giving you any specifics or having to sign up for it.
Just light a pipe and
That's
chat
right.
about it.
That's very interesting question. But no, folks are working on it. In fact, the Air Force has just had a 2-day conference on this type of issue.
Good, great. Let me shift to the combatant commander needs. So General Dickinson, the commander of U.S. Space Command, testified that space domain awareness is his #1 priority and #1 shortfall. But can you talk a little bit about what the DoD is doing to help alleviate this shortfall in his regard? And I know you're not in the acquisition side
Right.
for stuff, but I don't know if there's any policy implications or anything that policy can do to help out General Dickinson's issue.
So, I think, first of all, space domain awareness, very important, and we've talked about that some at the top of this, so I won't go into it again. But being able to do that right is more than just having sensors. It's how do you integrate the sensors to draw attention to those pieces that you need to be focused on. And that is also one of the differences now with thousands and thousands and thousands of commercial satellites, to say nothing of all the pieces of space debris. There's an awful lot of things in space. So you actually are going to need machines to help you filter out which pieces are interesting to look for. And you need to know these things because you want to say, is there something out of the normal happening in my domain that I need to watch or potentially respond to? The second part, of course, is this question of and to how far out. But even if we just talk about LEO and GEO, I think this ability to have better awareness and better understanding of, is that a threat action happening right there? We have to keep investing in this. And this is a place where allies can help, right? I mean, just geographically, allies can help, but also all sorts of allies and partners also have telescopes and other sensors, and a better way to integrate all of these things and come up with solutions based on kind of modern processing, I think would be massively useful.
I think that's a great point, and you hit on it earlier, the importance of our alliances. I think a lot of folks don't appreciate the fact that geography matters in space.
Tremendously.
And so, if you want to surveil the southern hemisphere space domain, you got to be in the southern hemisphere, unless you're having a satellite on orbit like GSAP. But even that has its limitations. So I couldn't agree more with you that our allies are going to be critical to not only space domain awareness, but perhaps launch resilience, perhaps some counter space capabilities that they could bring to bear that would help protect our soldiers, sailors, airmen, marine guardians that are operating in these domains. So I loved your emphasis on bringing the allies in and working closely with them. And then your point on not declassification, but kind of relaxing what we can talk about, overclassification, eliminating overclassification. And you want to hit on that again? Because I just think that's so critical, particularly if we want to do this.
Sure. So we'll touch two things. First, on the allied piece, let me just say, the National Defense Strategy focuses on allies, and I've said multiple times, we have true allies, right, in the ways that neither Russia nor China could literally ever hope to achieve. We don't have allies by force. We have allies by, common approach to the world, the security environment.
Sometimes they have allies because they have bags of money to distribute.
That's right.
But are not true.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's coercive, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, so our allies are a massive, massive asymmetric advantage that China and Russia cannot hope to have. But they're only an asymmetric advantage if we work together to operationalize that asymmetric advantage. And that's the thing we're talking about here. And yes, geography is absolutely one part of it, but the classification part turns out to be one part of it as well. So we had a CSPO meeting, the Combined Space Operations Principles Board meeting. It was in New Zealand in December, but it's the US, UK, New Zealand, Australia, France, Germany. I feel like I left one out. US, UK, nope, US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So Five Eyes, and then France and Germany. So seven nations, right? And working on how do we figure out how to be able to do information sharing at operational relevant speeds to be able to use that asymmetric advantage. Really good conversation. Folks really leaning into it. Really hard. And the thing that limits us is overclassification of information. Classification of information. Yeah. So working on that, I will say inside the department, the Deputy Secretary has directed kind of a SAP reform effort, and that is hopefully coming to some conclusion soon. Can't talk too much about any of that, obviously, but that's across all domains. But I think anyone in those systems has understood that the number of SAPs has kind of spiraled out of control, and how do we bring that back down to be able to cross-level folks to maximize our ability to be ready to fight and win.
That's great. The other side it occurs to me on eliminating overclassification, not declassification, as you point out, is that if you really want the American public to understand the threat, you have to be able to talk to them about it. If you want our elected leaders to fund the capabilities we need. It can't be all compartmented.
Absolutely.
It's got to be.
Absolutely.
We need to.
It has to be accessible enough to talk about.
Exactly. Great. Well, John, I've monopolized everyone's time here with my questions. I think, as we always do on the forum, we like to give our audience an opportunity to ask questions, and have a great assistant here. Aiden Poling is screening all the chat questions that have been coming in, and I'll ask Aiden to select one from the top of the list, and we'll let you address questions the audience might.
All right. All right.
Aiden?
We have a question coming in from Frank Purdy. He asks, how will the department work with NATO on the emerging Alliance Persistent Surveillance from Space APSS program?
I'll just address that generally. Thanks, Frank. I think, look, NATO is not a monolith, of course. It's really a collection of allies, but working with NATO on space and space domain awareness is absolutely essential as well. And I think that the conflict over Ukraine has helped kind of accentuate that space is part of a normal, it's one more operational domain that we need to be working in together.
Very good.
Great. We have another question from Michael Marrow. He asks, what new priorities for space will the fiscal year 24 budget reflect, if any?
Nice try, Michael. Wait and see. I think the current goal, and this is only a thing I read it on email, so I can't promise it, but I think the current goal is March 9th, roughly, for a budget drop, somewhere in early March. But I don't think there'll be any surprise to see that we're going to continue to invest in space. It's absolutely essential to the 21st century fight.
Great. Tim Ryan asks, do you see an unclassified version of the Strategic Space Review being released?
So thanks, Tim. I would say roughly no, but I don't want to spoil your hopes. I would say, look, that was internally tasked by the National Security Advisors, the DoD, and the IC. And so that is not really a document that would be turned into an unclassified document for release. But we do have this task from the Congress that Kevin mentioned during the discussion to provide an unclassified protect and defend strategy. And so we will have, something there. But the Space Strategic Review, we call it the SISR, the SSR. No, I don't anticipate that.
Okay. We also had a couple questions, kind of understandably, about balloons and NORAD. So, basically, what can space assets do to help alleviate this problem?
So, obviously, the U.S. government's been focused on this issue for a couple weeks now, including myself. I will say there is, sensor overlap. The same sensors that we use for missile defense, the same sensors we might use for space domain awareness can also be tuned, of course, to look at the stratosphere. And so how to tune those or understand how to use the information coming back from those to get better awareness of that domain is definitely part of the solution. So, kind of sensors are multi-use and figuring out the right balance of resources for these different parts of what they can see is really an important piece going forward.
Would you agree it's a domain, if you will, and between 100,000 feet and 400,000 feet, that in the past there wasn't a lot going on there. So maybe our focus was a little lower in the atmosphere, and now we have to pay attention to that?
Yeah, so I think, we've got radars trained for cruise missile threats, like low air breathing things, but I think this idea here is big. I will also say it's not just a Department of Defense issue, though, right? I mean, the FAA is supposed to regulate our airspace, and the airspace keeps going up past, commercial jets, and so I think this kind of growing awareness of this problem is going to be part of this conversation.
Great, thanks.
We have a question from Lavinia Anderson asking how the Air and Space Force is looking to recruit young people for the Space Force, given the surge of high-tech talent that is entering the workforce now.
So I can't speak to the Air Forces, but I can speak a little bit to the Space Forces, and I'll just say Space Force is doing fine on recruiting at the moment, is my understanding. I think the world is doing that for them in some level. Space is fascinating. I tell the story, my kid's got a stuffed rocket ship. Other kids have teddy bears. My kid's got a stuffed rocket ship. But the fact is, you can watch a launch any month almost now, and so it's accessible, it's exciting, and it's fun. And so I think folks with a kind of an engineering bent or inclination, or maybe they become more interested in engineering or science because of these programs, some percentage of them think the Space Force is a place to go. And I think it's a small force, so it also has this other solve. It's like the Army. It's got a small number of folks it's trying to solve. And I think I personally think recruiting the Space Force, of which I'm doing some right now, join the Space Force, is in a good place, and I think will continue to be.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, General Raymond said he had 10 applications for every slot, and I think all the services
really
would envy that.
Right? Yeah, that's really something.
And not everybody wants to be on the technology side; they may be more on the operational side.
Yeah, I will say my hope is this is not a new statement, but right. I mean, space is interesting. It is happening now. People can see it. My hope is it gets more kids interested in science and engineering, STEM disciplines. We need that from a national security standpoint. We need that from an economic standpoint. And also, it's fun.
Right. And NASA going back to the moon helps too, right?
It does. No, that's right. It's not just DOD. I don't want to pretend that it is. It's not just DOD. It's the commercial explosion. It's NASA's string of successes. It's the James Webb Space Telescope. All of these pieces combined, space is becoming more, available and accessible. And that hopefully is driving more folks' interest in these different disciplines. Absolutely.
And since I've butted into the Q&A here, I'm going to stay there for just a second, if you don't mind, folks. We didn't talk about cislunar. But I mean,
man, I thought we were going to get through this without talking about cislunar.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and really, I just want to, do you see, I mean, obviously it's a policy issue first, and then it's a capability issue. But, but what are your thoughts on, or maybe you could tell us how DOD is starting to mature their thoughts on policy with regard to beyond geosynchronous orbit out to the lunar orbits and Lagrange points, et cetera. We're seeing Chinese activity and Russian activity.
Yeah, I guess I would say in a priority order, I think our ability to focus on the GEO and LEO problem is really key. And that's kind of where we're focused now. I don't want to throw complete cold water on it. Obviously, good to know what's going on in space, but space is really big. Right.
That's what I've heard.
And so I think we need to get our hands on this piece at home.
Yeah. Well, and I always thought, and I'll bounce this off you, that NASA has an interest in what's going on between the Earth and the Moon, and maybe there's a partnership opportunity there for cislunar awareness.
Yeah, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing it and working on it. I'm just saying if I were to rank that, it would be below kind of the near.
The dog closest to the sled. Gotcha. Yeah. All right, good. Hayden, back to you for another question.
We have time for one last question.
Okay.
Is there any plan to counter PRC or Russian access to ground sites across the world, located in other countries, as a way to limit their ability to build or maintain their own SDA library?
I see. In other words, ability to stop them.
For example, the Andean Ridge, that's in the southern hemisphere, and we know the Chinese, through universities, the Russians as well, and other commercial things, use those as platforms to surveil space. Yeah,
so I think there's two things in tension there. So first of all, obviously that would be great. Just say, hey, you guys can only have a telescope in your home country, and otherwise you can't have anywhere else. That would be great. And obviously that would be to our advantage. And so I will just say, on some level, that is old think. I'm trying to coin a phrase here. But space is becoming increasingly transparent, right? Hobbyists can set up telescopes and look at the sky and record things. Between the internet and the ability to have access to some of these things, like a lot of things that you think no one will notice, you can now see. Academic telescopes coming. All of these things are coming. There is some future state we basically have space transparency, not unlike the Navy worries about, ocean transparency. We're not there yet, but we're kind of in that transition phase. And so delaying the adversary's ability to have kind of that visibility all around is a worthy goal. I think going forward, that's going to get harder and harder.
Yeah. probably today more on the diplomatic side to get countries to agree in time of conflict to maybe stop providing that or allowing that information. I mean, there's other ways to do it to our advantage, but I think that's clear what you said. Thanks. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the Spacepower Forum event. I want to thank you again, Secretary Plumb, for joining us here today. And from all of us here at the Mitchell Institute, have a great Space Power Canada Day.
Thanks, everybody.